But there's just a great momentum in the room, and I was just chatting with Carlene about the number of attendees. This is the largest conference to date with 650 attendees across in-person and virtual. So I think that says two things. First, Florida is either a very hot market or we all wanted a little dose of humidity. And second, we are at a really important moment for this industry. It is in demand, there's growing momentum and interest, and a lot of that is due to some of the exciting updates that we've seen on both the national and the state level now. So we're gonna try to highlight some of those opportunities today. We have a panel of Crystal Bergman, who's going to offer us a special address. Then I'll touch on some quick high-level national updates and then close out with Frank Bernardino to cover Florida. So I want to first introduce Crystal. Crystal is the Senior Director for Climate Resilience at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. Prior to this role, she was the Senior Advisor for Climate to HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge. Crystal is an expert in green and energy-efficient affordable housing and has spent much of her career working to advance green and equitable building and climate priorities at the federal level. Outside of government, she led Fannie Mae's multifamily affordable housing preservation work with underserved markets and served as an advisor for the company's Environment, Social, Governance Division. Crystal holds a master's degree in public administration from New York University and is focused on water and environmental and energy policy. Please welcome Crystal.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me to your conference. Judging from the agenda, it looks very informative, jam-packed. And I got in late last night around midnight, and judging from the bar and the lobby, it looked like a very enjoyable conference. People have been finding a lot of ways to connect with each other, so that's fantastic. And I'm happy to bring greetings from CEQ's chair, Brenda Mallory, who wishes she could be here today, but I'm glad to be here in her place. I want to discuss a little bit about how the Biden-Harris administration is advancing a number of initiatives on nature, given how protecting, conserving, restoring, building with nature can help us reach our climate, biodiversity, and our equity goals. So the White House Council on Environmental Quality is working to drive awareness, adoption of policies and actions to protect and enhance those qualities. So today I'll talk about some of the key initiatives, all of which are really first of their kind, and touch on how some new funding from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act are investing in our nature goals to ensure resilience. So we'll talk a little bit about the America the Beautiful conservation goals, our nature-based solutions roadmap, new guidance on connectivity corridors, and some brief updates on funding announcements from bill and Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act funds. So first, the America the Beautiful initiative is the nation's first ever national conservation policy with the goal of conserving and preserving 30% of U.S. lands and waters by 2030. The president laid out a vision through the initiative to combat climate change, biodiversity loss, and inequity. To achieve this, we've been focused on 6 areas. 1, nature-deprived communities. 2, tribally led conservation. 3, expanding collaborative conservation of fish and wildlife habitats and corridors. 4, increasing access for outdoor recreation. 5, private land conservation, including incentivizing, rewarding voluntary conservation efforts, and creating jobs by investing in restoration and resilience. In addition to the conservation efforts, on Earth Day last year, the president issued Executive Order 1472, strengthening the nation's forests, communities, and local economies. Here, the president called for federal government to accelerate the use of nature-based solutions as a critical tool in our fight against climate change, nature loss, and environmental injustice. The federal government was also called to issue guidance related to the valuation of ecosystems, environmental services, and asked to begin the process of building a national system for accounting for natural assets. And finally, working to launched the nation's first national nature assessment. So taking a little bit of a deeper dive into those, the nature-based roadmap, for example, last year outlined 5 areas where the federal government can improve the use of nature-based solutions. As mentioned, the president directed the government to raise ambitions and address challenges that slow the expansion of nature-based solutions. The report incorporated information from 27 federal agencies and the White House and is focused on unlocking nature-based solutions through policies and guidance, increasing and improving access to funding for nature-based solutions, leading by example by expanding the use of nature-based solutions in federal facilities, lands and waters, and building the nature-based solutions workforce through workforce training and apprenticeships. So the beauty of nature-based solutions is that you can iterate and learn as we go, but we have to get started. So we're really focused on implementation in the next phase. So stay tuned on more announcements as those systems are being set up. In terms of national capital accounting, as we all know, one of the hardest things is to quantify and communicate ecosystem services and environmental benefits. The United States doesn't have yet a standard set of agreed upon economic indicators that tell the value of nature and its benefits. So while we know, for example, that wetlands are critical for preventing flood or that a healthy watershed is important to municipal water supplies, we don't all talk about them in the same way. That's why President Biden directed building a national system of accounting for national assets or natural assets. In August of this year, the United States issued a U.S. draft national strategy that recommends that the federal government expand and build on the existing national economic accounts to produce a new ongoing set of statistics. The statistics and accounts will measure the changing wealth of natural assets, put nature on the national balance sheet, and produce accounts in monetary and physical units. We expect the first pilot account pieces to come out before the end of this year, 2023. But the full process will take many years, not because of a lack of dedication or urgency, but because we know it's important to do this well to make sure that those accounts last and those statistics last for the next generations, as many of our other economic indicators have lasted. In terms of the National Nature Assessment, we currently don't have a full report of the state of nature in the United States. Existing reports and assessments provide partial views of changes and comprehensive knowledge on the major aspects of global change. But the National Nature Assessment will assess the status, trends, and future projections of America's lands, waters, wildlife, biodiversity, and ecosystems. This first assessment will be published in a few years, but work by the U.S. Global Change Research Program is underway now to have a National Nature Assessment that will parallel the National Climate Assessment that underpin all of our federal climate work. So I'll talk for a few minutes about connectivity corridors. Just a couple of months ago, President Biden mentioned wildlife corridors in his remarks at the first ever White House Conservation and Action Summit. So that was a big deal for CEQ, for us. And that day, many of you know, CEQ released guidance to federal agencies on how to better incorporate connectivity and corridors into federal planning and decision making. Almost 1 year ago today, CEQ Chair Mallory had the good fortune to travel here to Florida to visit the construction of the I-4 wildlife crossing along the Florida Wildlife Corridor and to visit the Avon Park Air Force Range Sentinel landscape to learn about the contributions to the wildlife corridor and the landscape scale conservation and stewardship. What those visits made abundantly clear is just how crucial coordination and collaboration is in this work and connectivity work. During that work, she met people from NGOs, state agencies, federal agencies, municipalities, research entities, private sector, private landowners, and the thread connecting all of those people were the wildlife corridor. So zooming out from Florida, we know that there are examples similar to this all across the country, locally led efforts uniting diverse groups of dedicated people in stewarding and connecting our landscapes and watersheds. A lot of those efforts are being led by non-federal entities, tribes, states, local government, private sector, NGOs. So by creating some consistency and clarity across the federal natural resource management portfolio, the intent is for the guidance to make it easier for federal agencies to coordinate and collaborate better, not just internally, but externally as well. The timing seemed especially right for this type of guidance. Both the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act provide significant investments in conservation and restoration efforts. The bipartisan infrastructure law alone includes over $1 billion in funding directly just tied to aquatic and terrestrial connectivity. The hope is that connectivity and corridors guidance will assist in getting that funding out the door more quickly and in a more coordinated fashion. And that's something we're trying to do across all of the funding that comes from the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. Another example of a testament to the administration's focus on natural habitat and restoration, just last month, NOAA announced $562 million for funding nearly 150 projects across 30 coastal states and territories to make communities and the economy more resilient to climate change as part of the administration's Investing in America agenda. At an event here in Florida, Vice President Harris highlighted how this announcement reflects the administration's commitment to tackle the climate crisis, ensure that communities are more resilient to extreme weather events. The awards are made under NOAA's Climate Ready Coast Initiative and are funded by the administration's bipartisan infrastructure law that's also bolstered by the Inflation Reduction Act. The awards included $477 million for 149 nature-based infrastructure projects in 30 coastal states and territories. Also included $46 million in additional funding for National Fish and Wildlife Foundation National Coastal Research Fund, and another nearly $40 million in non-competitive funding to 34 states and territorial coastal zone management programs and 30 national research reserves that work in partnership. Demand for this funding focused on preparing for, adapting to climate change is high. In this first year, the Climate Ready Coast far exceeded the funding available in terms of the applications. So in response to this high demand, NOAA is leveraging these requests with funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, allowing more high-quality projects to be funded and to move forward. Before I close, I'll just say a couple of words on NEPA as well. I know this audience is very interested in NEPA. CEQ's NEPA efforts are aimed at making environmental assessments and environmental impact statements more efficient, transparent, and easily accessible to the public. And as you may be aware, CEQ has been engaged in a two-phase process, two-phase review of its government-wide NEPA regulations. The first phase concluded with a final rule last April, included clarifications on the scope of the effects analysis, making sure that agencies are considering direct, indirect, and cumulative effects. The second phase involves a comprehensive review and rulemaking proposal. I can't speak directly to the status and when that will be released, but I can say that it's currently an interagency review process, and so you can follow its progress at regulations.gov. We understand the critical importance of mitigation activities to this work, and that's why we released guidance on mitigation in the NEPA process, and that guidance continues to be really relevant to agencies today. We see mitigation playing a big role in the areas of NEPA and also addressing greenhouse gas emissions and the impacts from climate change, and in addressing disproportionate and adverse impacts to communities and environmental justice concerns. So I'll wrap up because I know we have some really exciting speakers and dialogue. We'll get to Q&A, but I just wanted to, again, thank you for allowing me to be here today. I'll end by thanking you again for your partnership. I know you are all doing the day-to-day work on the ground to make these programs and these dollars be put to good use and this work a reality, working towards cleaner air, water, healthier environment that's more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So thank you very much. Looking forward to our discussion.
All right. Great, thank you, Crystal. I'm going to now walk through just a couple of national and industry policy updates. For those of you that I haven't met yet, I'm Sarah Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of the Ecological Restoration Business Association, which is a national trade association for the industry that's focused on mitigation banking as well as new frontiers and emerging markets that will hopefully fully capture the several ecological values that this industry can provide. I've been fortunate to serve in this role for just shy of 7 years now, since November 2016. So I've been through 2 presidential administrations and multiple congressional swings. And during that time, I've really appreciated the opportunity to speak with and learn from each of you. So thank you always for your time. For my remarks today, I only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to stay at a very high level, and then I'm happy to dive into more details on any of the topics that I touch on during the Q&A. So we'll go to the next slide. see. Is this something? There we go. Okay, so first just want to set the stage. So we're currently in a divided Congress ahead of the election, which usually means a lot of congressional hearings. But we do, as we're going into the election, we see that both Republicans on the House side with their permitting reform, as well as some Senate Democrats with their permitting reform, are trying to find some sort of progress, potentially in the middle, to have a win for either the Democrats or the Republican base and bring a win home to their respective voters. We still are also going into a season where we have the usual legislative cycle and lineup of bills that we'll try to pass. We've got a lot of discussions going on around the Farm Bill, appropriations, of course, trying to provide funding to our agencies, and then the Water Resources Development Act, which we've been tracking both GAO studies that were in the last iteration of WRDA, as well as going into this next WRDA, hopefully including some language on opportunities to improve core contracting for civil works mitigation needs. So still going to try to get a lot done in this congressional environment, but it is a more difficult congressional environment than usual. We're also expecting, of course, a slew of committee hearings ahead of the election, and as agencies are just reaching the point where they're starting to implement some of their bipartisan infrastructure law program funding and having to answer and have accountability for some of that funding. Meanwhile, agencies are racing against the clock, trying to institutionalize certain policies and agendas that have been on the docket for a few years now, and also trying to move this unprecedented $46.5 billion, much of which expires in 2026, under the bipartisan infrastructure law, to actual on-the-ground projects. So a lot of difficult tasks ahead. And this just shows a brief snapshot of the funding under the bipartisan infrastructure law. And I liked, EPIC has a great, the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, they have a great visual that shows, all of this infrastructure funding is going to need mitigation. And so that's creating demand for the offsets that this industry produces. But it also needs just partners who know how to move fast and how to quickly move these funds. And so not only will we have the traditional infrastructure need for mitigation, but also agencies trying to think about how to expand the pie of their usual partners that they work with to go out and deploy these funds fast enough and to meet their funding expirations by 2026. And here's just a snapshot of that very ambitious regulatory agenda. These are just a few of the actions that IRBA has been tracking. So as Crystal mentioned, NEPA Phase 2, we're hoping to see the codification of some mitigation policies there. We're also looking at the Migratory Bird Treaty Act permit program, which will hopefully have a role for this industry to plug into. That's also currently pending at OIRA. We just commented on the Endangered Species Act Section 10 revisions that were issued, looking at improvements to enhancement of survival permits as well as incidental take permits. We're very hopeful that in June we will at least see, or maybe later this month, we'll let Fish and Wildlife speak more to this, but hopefully see species mitigation-wide policies across the service, and also Endangered Species Act compensatory mitigation policy. And then currently still showing June for the species mitigation rule to be issued, as well as a rule on the NPDES program coming out from EPA on water quality trading. So going into those early summer months with a lot on the docket. And lastly, I also wanted to flag the Bureau of Land Management recently issued a conservation rule that comments are due on June 20th. So again, a lot happening in the next few months here. In August, we still have slated some potential modifications to Nationwide Permit 12 that may no longer be the case. In November, the WOTUS Rule 2 iteration was moved back from September to November, so we'll be watching that closely. I'm going to talk about WOTUS a little bit more. And then going into winter and spring next year, we'll already be starting to think about the next reissuance of nationwide permits. So clearly a very ambitious agenda ahead here. And so I do want to take a moment to talk about the topic on everyone's mind, WOTUS, and where we're at. We thought we would have a SACIT decision by now that we could try to decipher, but we don't. And I'll say I will not in these next two slides do justice to Professor Royal Gardner's usual performance, and I forgot my Grim Reaper costume here, so sorry, Roy. But I will give an overview. So. The Biden administration's WOTUS rule has now been in place since March 20th. Shortly after implementation, though, we swiftly saw a number of states that followed with litigation. And so in succession, we had a Texas court that issued an injunction applicable in Texas and Idaho. We then had a North Dakota court follow with an injunction that covered 24 states, and they gave us a little bit of a hint of some of the objections on the merits, citing that the Biden rule reads out navigability from the statute, it deviates from significant nexus, it's unintelligible, and the boundaries are unlimited. And so we think that SCOTUS will likely try to address that lack of boundaries in their decision. And then we had as well, Kentucky, under their own appeal, was first received a statewide administrative stay, and then just yesterday they had that stay extended as an injunction pending appeal. So that just happened yesterday. So we still do have the rule blocked in 27 states, and we're back in a similar scenario that we were when the Navigable Waters Protection Rule was in place, and we had patchwork implementation across the country, unfortunately. So all eyes are on the SACIT decision. We had thought it would maybe come out last week. Now we're thinking maybe this next Monday, but most likely it will be June, and it's an instance where the court is still grappling with the right pathway to take to find, hopefully, some majority consensus. So here's a couple of trying to read the tea leaves here, SCOTUS predictions on WOTUS, and I've got a little cartoon there for any fellow literary nerds. So first, we heard from most of the justices in listening to the oral arguments that significant nexus, it's not in the statute. They were skeptic of it. They brought up, is there a third test? Are there other tests? And so we're expecting them to come up with another iteration of some test. Sort of the question is the test that they come up with, will that also be grounded in the statute, or will we have just another scenario of significant nexus that's outside the scope of the statute? It's likely that they will look to the Maui decision, where there was a majority consensus, and it was a majority consensus in favor of clean water. So we could see them trying to manufacture some sort of multi-factor test like they did there. And we're thinking also that the litigation that's going on will likely be influencing those conservative justice contingency to think hard about what are the intelligible principles that we need to articulate in this multi-factor test that the agencies and then the public can clearly implement on the ground. Justice Roberts was on the court for Rapanos, and he saw the challenges that Rapanos, having a fractured decision, left us with. And so we're thinking that he is probably playing a really important role in trying to bring the justices together around some clear majority. And most likely we'll see the decision come out and remand back to the agencies to proceed with their November rulemaking, trying to come up with some sort of middle ground and use that criteria in the next rulemaking. So this leads to the question, though, even if we have the SACIT decision come out, will we ever truly find a durable WOTUS? It's likely that whatever rule EPA issues in November 2023 could be challenged yet again and work its way through the court system. And then we also have, on May 1st, SCOTUS agreed to take a case that would directly challenge either overruling Chevron deference or severely narrowing it. So clearly going in a direction of trying to limit agency discretion and potentially not being able to defer to that discretion if the next iteration of WOTUS is again challenged. We could be in this vicious cycle until Congress acts or we have a slam dunk opinion coming out of SCOTUS, which is unlikely. So I think as an industry and something that came out in the bankers forum that we had on Tuesday, we had a table on WOTUS, and WOTUS has always been one of the top topics. But folks felt like, what can we do? We've had some advocacy on it. We've, as an industry, filed an amicus brief, but there isn't a clear action forward. And so there was more energy and excitement, I think, in that forum around the concept of looking beyond the constraints of WOTUS and instead looking at multi-benefit banks and just how do we look at the big picture demand for our industry that we're clearly seeing across other sectors at the national level and the state level. And an important role for us to get there is we need the trust and collaboration with our agency partners to do that, to build those multiple demand drivers across different programs and across voluntary restoration funding. So that's the direction where we're going to try to go and become a little more positive now coming out of this WOTUS concerns. So here's just a quick recap of some of the industry priorities. First, we're thinking about how do we open up new markets to maximize incentives for restoration. We're thinking of what is the fungibility of credits. Could you even have a scenario where if after a certain amount of time when credits have been on ledgers for a certain number of years where you have government recognizing the value that these projects have provided and buying back some of those credits to lessen some of the risk and invest in the outcomes these projects are providing. Key for any new markets, we need consistent standards and regulations on offset requirements. That's both the legal and financial as well as the requirements that are specific to that particular resource. And we need to be thinking about opening up eligibility and removing any sort of eligibility barriers for the private sector to participate, which could be competitive bid processes or building that in to legislation and programs initially. Something that I have heard more and more about within the industry over the past few years is just procurement challenges, basic procurement challenges. The industry is selling an environmental product and the government has to be in a position to be able to buy that. And so thinking about how do we tackle some of these challenges with different agency councils interpreting contracting needs differently? Can we reach some sort of high level of agreement on a scope of different contracting models that work well? A few more priorities here. One of the top ones that IRBA's been working on for several years now is just how do we help and empower our agency partners? One of the first things here is needing to have sustained funding for increased staffing to match this increased workload, both under the bipartisan infrastructure law and to address the long backlog of existing mitigation and other restoration projects. But also, do want to flag, we see opportunities for all of us to work smarter. And I think you've probably heard from our former industry veteran, now Virginia DEQ Director Mike Rolban, about the PEEP. And those are the types of tools we would love to see implemented on a national stage. And it includes accountability also for the sponsors. So not just regulators, but sponsors also tracking their time and having transparency about where they're at in the process. And then one of the last items that we're trying to tackle is just bringing this concept of cutting green tape to the federal level. So you've likely heard yesterday from EPIC and Becca and Steve that worked on the MBI timelines report that found it's over 1,000 days to permit a mitigation bank. That's just going to lead us to this complete credit crunch where permittees and others are concerned about what's the value of credits. If we can't bring them to market, they can't be the preferred option. And we don't want to undercut what's clearly the best and most advanced option for the environment and the model that we all believe in. So we've got to find a way to work faster. And then lastly, I'll just close on overall, we're looking to leverage markets. We want to listen to lessons learned, both with best practices, as well as taking those lessons learned to new markets so we can leapfrog ahead. And we want to invite innovation. This is a performance-based program. The private sector can carry that risk. And so let's invite innovation in new restoration models and achieving diverse ecological outcomes. So I will close with that. I do want to encourage folks, you can submit questions in the app and I'll view them there for the moderating session. And we can also take some from the audience, but just encourage folks to use the app. Okay, next I want to introduce our final speaker, Frank Bernardino. Frank is a partner at Anfield Consulting, which is a boutique consulting and lobbying firm specializing in water and environmental resources management that serves both private and public clients. He has over 36 years of experience working in Florida's environmental, political, and governmental arenas, including on wetlands planning and regulatory work at Miami-Dade County and water resources management lobbying for the South Florida Water Management District. He holds a master's degree in biology and a bachelor of science degree in environmental studies, both from Florida International University. He's widely recognized for his work in securing funding support for water management initiatives throughout Florida, and he is a recipient of the Florida Senate's prestigious Medallion of Excellence for his dedicated service in protecting Florida's natural resources. Please help me in welcoming Frank Bernardino.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank you and welcome you to the state of Florida. I'm probably on other panels, folks have welcomed you, but as a Floridian, I'd like to extend again my gratitude for all of you to have your conference here this year. So what's so special about Florida? And I would quickly say nothing. Other than we have our experience of our own. We're on a journey of our own, and hopefully through the journey that I'm about to discuss briefly, you may find some parallels of some things that may be useful for you at home. So in Florida, our biggest challenge is a water quality challenge, and this current administration made a hallmark of their first 4 years in office to tackle this issue. They proposed broad and very expansive programs and provided the funding necessary to begin to implement those programs. And now as they're coming around to their second term, they have invested even more money into it. And the reason is very, very simple, because it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum that you're on, and for those, as you may have picked up in my introduction, I'm a lobbyist. I spend a lot of time in the Capitol trying to educate our leaders about the importance of these issues, and I'm one of your strongest advocates. I believe there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but we're not going to get the work done if the state and others don't invest in that work. And so the legislature has seen through our red tide episodes, our algal bloom episodes, how poor water quality is impacting the lives of Floridians every day, our property values, our health and well-being, and it really has triggered something, a unique response among both parties to want to tackle this issue comprehensively, and we're trying to do that. But the scale of that challenge is enormous. I must have skipped a slide. Hold on. Yeah, no, there it is. These figures come from this year's report. They're released just in this January about the needs of the state of Florida for all things water infrastructure. And they become significant when you talk about the level of expenditures that we're currently investing in the state. But when you total everything that the state is going to have to do with regard to water supply, water quality protection, ecosystem restoration, stormwater management, you're talking about well over $130 billion a year, $30 billion over the next 20 years that the state is going to have to invest. And for water quality alone, the last bottom two numbers, you'll see is $29 billion. So a significant amount of funds that we're going to have to spend. And you say, well, where do these numbers come from and why is that significant? The very first thing that we needed to do in the state of Florida in order to address this challenge was convince policymakers that we were in trouble. That these episodes of blue-green algae blooms and algal red tide and such were not one-offs, that as time progressed they were going to become more and more frequent, and that we needed to do something about it. The difference is that as opposed to relying upon reports from NGOs and well-meaning organizations that are always in the face of legislators reminding them about how poor of a job they're doing, we said, don't listen to them. Why don't you rely upon the institute that you've created, the office that you rely upon to give you economic forecasting information in the state of Florida? And for us, that's the Office of Economic Demographics and Research. And in 2016, we managed to pass a piece of legislation that requires that office on an annual basis to derive the numbers in each of those areas of water infrastructure. So there's numbers for water supply, there's numbers for wastewater management, there's numbers for ecological restoration and stormwater management. So in fact, the information that you see here in this slide, and I'll point to the top number and the bottom numbers, those two come about because in later years, after 2016, the legislature said, you know, we have gaps, we need more information, we need better information. And so they passed legislation that require all of the local governments in the state of Florida to provide them with a 5 and 20-year forecast of their needs in both of those areas. So the legislature can rely on this information and on these numbers to know that they're true. And the most important thing to me as an advocate for infrastructure investment in the state of Florida is I wanted to give them a number that they could not run from. When I lecture at the Florida Association of Counties or the League of Cities, or when I'm invited to present before a legislative committee, I'm a little melodramatic, but I say, this is your Flint, Michigan moment. As of today, everybody who's in this audience, you may deny or reject certain arguments that are presented to you with regard to the state of Florida's water infrastructure, but what you cannot run from are these numbers. These numbers are real. And it's your responsibility as legislators, or it's your responsibility as community leaders in counties and cities across the state to do something about this. And for your industry, you are at the core of doing something about this. Most of the projects that are currently being looked at, that are currently being planned, are things that you're going to be involved in implementing. We finally got to our leadership. This year, we're very fortunate to have a speaker in the House of Representatives, a gentleman by the name of Paul Renner, who this is his backyard. And when he saw these numbers and he saw these presentations, he said, I will not leave my 2-year term as leader without doing something significant in this regard. Florida will not be falling further behind when I'm done as Speaker of the House of Representatives. Now, they've begun to deliver on some of these priorities. It's a 2-year process, and I'll talk briefly about some of the bills that we adopted this year, but it's an ongoing process to get to the finish line. This numbers, it should be impressive to you. It's impressive to us who advocate for water infrastructure funding. These are the amount of state dollars that the state invests in water infrastructure every year in this 16-year window that you see here. The thing that's important is you can point at the work of the administration in the last 4, now 5th year, to see that the amounts are growing exponentially. They acknowledge and are investing in the things that need to happen here in the state of Florida. What is staggering is a piece of information that Ansley, I had a chance to sit in on the stormwater markets session before this, and one of the things that I always do with the audience is I say, as a percentage of the state budget, the state invests approximately 11 to 12% of their funds in roads, bridges, and that type of infrastructure. On average, over this period of time, the state has invested 0.7% of the state budget on all things water, everything, anything that you could possibly imagine. Water supply, ecosystem restoration. It's an infinitesimal amount. And when I share this information in front of public groups, everybody's always shocked, because when you quiz them and you say, what do you think the number is? You get answers 3%, 4%, 5%, 0.7%. And the question that I always ask policymakers about that number is that an accurate reflection of your values? Do we value water in such a comparative amount that we invest 10 times the amount that we do in water and roadways? Is that a reflection of our values? And everybody says, no, it's not. Well, that's what the numbers say it is. So are we going to do something about it? So what are we doing in Florida? And this is my last slide, so you'll be very happy about that. Is that they're investing in different efforts throughout the state. First, statewide resiliency effort. The state has invested over $1 billion in the last 2 years, and one of the things that they're very seriously looking at is green infrastructure as part of the resiliency formula. As a matter of fact, I had conversations with the speaker, and we were supposed to do it this year, but we didn't get it done. Hopefully in the second year that we will, is require that a percentage of the funds that the state sets aside of the hundreds of millions of dollars that they're doing be set aside specifically for green infrastructure along the coastline. Everglades restoration, anybody who's been around Florida knows how important that is, and billions of dollars are being spent on that effort. Water quality protection, the state is going to be implementing a new stormwater rule. The state's regulations are going to require the participation of the public and the private sector in achieving the goals of attaining our load reductions in the water bodies throughout the state. Regional water supply development is a very important thing in the middle of the state. Mostly, you see the big, over the Orlando area, we have an area called the Central Florida Water Initiative, and it's where the 3 water management districts come together, and a lot of time and energy is being invested in restoring the wetlands and river systems that have been impacted by past consumption of water and drainage. So in order for us to take a step forward in water supply, it is imperative that we repair the damage that we've done. And the state laws that have been enacted are intended to accomplish that very thing. Springs protection in the northern part of Florida, the state invests somewhere between $50 to $100 million a year in helping to protect and restore our springs. And lastly, the Indian River Lagoon was one of the governor's big initiatives for this year. He announced a $100 million program a year for the next 4 years to do restoration work in the Indian River Lagoon. There, the focus is primarily seagrass restoration and coastal infrastructure. So these are just some of the issues that we're working on in Florida. My take-home message, if you're not from Florida, is it will help you in your advocacy work. If you can get a report similar to the one that we put together with regard to the EDR report that annually updates these figures, it makes it so that policymakers can't run from it. And if you're in Florida, we need your help to continue to impress upon policymakers whenever you have an opportunity to interact with them that investment in green infrastructure, investment in wetland restoration, and investment in river and water quality protection is paramount, not just for the health of the ecosystem itself, but critical to the economy of the state. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Crystal and Frank. So we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. Folks are welcome to ask questions from the audience. We've also received one on the chat and have a few prepared, so don't be shy on jumping in and asking questions. First, I want to start with a question for Crystal. And looking at, you provided a great overview of a lot of different programs that offer opportunity for this industry. Where do you see the greatest opportunity, though, knowing this industry skill set, the ability to deploy private capital in advance to achieve ecological outcomes? Where do you see the greatest opportunity for us to assist the Biden administration's conservation and resiliency priorities? And then what do you see as some of the biggest hurdles there, too?
Sure, so thanks so much for the question. And I think in some ways the biggest opportunity for the industry is also some of the biggest hurdles for government, which is that this is enormous, there's enormous federal investment happening all at once from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, from the Inflation Reduction Act. Agencies have spent a lot of time, perhaps individually, thinking about their individual programs. Maybe they've kind of iterated on them over years, they've scaled them up or down, but not a lot of time thinking about how those programs interact with other similar programs from other agencies, from other parts of the government, from state and local efforts. And so there's this, I think, an enormous need and an enormous opportunity for private sector, for others who know the industry, who know the different parts of the puzzle pieces of where those dollars can flow and where they come from, to actually do some of the legwork to figure out how those programs can and should work together. And that's a lot of what I'm doing in my role, is trying to figure out how do we make sure that all of the agencies are marching together towards the same end goal, and doing so efficiently and doing so equitably, but we need a lot of help with that. So where there's expertise, it's needed. So respond to RFIs, respond to NOFOs, respond to calls for contractors. It's needed.
Great, that's encouraging,
Yeah.
definitely. Okay, want to next have a question for Frank. And you had a great slide that showed Florida's different water management districts laid out, which is a bit unique, and the water management districts play a more active role in Florida in terms of project approvals than they do in some of the other states. From your time working with them, are there certain water management districts that stand out that maybe have best practices and tips maybe for this industry to keep in mind as you're working with those entities?
Sure. If you've worked in Florida, you'll know that even though from a geographic standpoint they may be close to each other, from a financial standpoint they're very, very different, and thus the opportunities and the challenges that they're trying to meet are different. The South Florida Water Management District has been responsible for the restoration of the Everglades for a long time, and actually $1 out of every $2 that the state invests in water infrastructure as a whole goes to that agency for that program. In the Southwest Florida water, the Tampa area, the big issue there is water supply. And they are very, very progressive in terms of cost sharing with local governments in order to implement those kinds of projects. That's kind of been their hallmark. In this area, the St. Johns River Water Management District does a little blend of both. The restoration of the St. Johns River, which is here right outside the hotel, as well as helping the communities that are trying to implement water supply projects. Because one of the things that people don't understand is that yes, in Florida we have a lot of water, but it hasn't been managed properly. And so there are a lot of places in the state where you literally cannot access water through traditional sources. You have to implement alternative supplies. And then if there's anybody here from either of the two smaller districts, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but they are significantly smaller and their programs are trailing, but therein lies a great amount of opportunity, right? Those are the areas that are less developed in the state, but where there still is a lot of need, and I think those two agencies are up and coming.
That's great, that's helpful overview, appreciate it. I'm not seeing any questions from the audience, so lucky, we do have one in the back. If we have a mic that we can reach to her, great.
Janet Herrick, SWCA. I want to know if there are specific targets about where money would like to be spent within the state. I know that there was an initiative for septic tank upgrades in communities that couldn't afford it. Do any of these acts have like monies that they would like to see in those kinds of programs without actually saying do this thing?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Septic tanks are an enormous source of pollution here in the state, and the state is doing a number of things that are rather progressive. One of the things it did this year, they just passed a piece of legislation that says if you're basically anywhere in the state where you have an impaired water body and you have a parcel that's an acre of size or less, you're going to be required to hook up to central sewer if it is available to you. If it is not available to you by a date certain deadline, those systems are going to have to be converted into advanced treatment systems in order to attempt to remove more pollutants out of the water, groundwater. The state has coupled that with this year $200 million grant program to assist citizens in the state in accessing dollars to help them with those transitions, be they a hookup or replacement of their system. And one of the things that they're going to require local governments to do is to have web pages and education portals in their county and city homepages that provide citizens with information about how to access that grant funding and that support funding. But we've got a long way to go. I mean, obviously the demand and the need in the state is way bigger than the funds that we're expending right now.
That's great. I see we've got a question from our friend, Professor Gardner.
Hi, Roy Gardner, Stetson Law School. Thanks for the great presentations. Question for Sarah and then Frank. Sarah, in one of the slides, there's federal funding that's available to combat legacy pollution, and I didn't know if you had any additional details on that you might be able to provide. And then, Frank, with respect to legacy pollution, so ag, nobody wants to tackle ag in the state of Florida. Do you see anything on the horizon to deal with agriculture's contribution to the harmful algal blooms that we've been dealing with, and to what extent, even if it's not regulatory, can you envision programs that would involve this community with the ag community to try to deal with our very, very challenging water quality issues? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Royal. So I think first, just on the legacy pollution from a high level, we're seeing growing interest from companies within the industry in trying to play a role in helping to address some of those remediation concerns. So it's funding that cuts across multiple different agencies and existing programs, and we're anxious to find an entry point for this industry to be able to participate in some of those projects and some of those cleanup efforts. I think it just helps diversify. It's the same skill set and the same type of restoration that you're looking for, but helps to diversify outside of just those traditional offset programs. So seeing it as kind of a new potential emerging market field, but it does cover a number of diverse different programs. I don't know, Crystal, if you want to speak to any, may not. It's deep in the weeds. I'll turn it then to Frank for the second part.
With regard to agriculture and in their contribution to the pollution problems in the state of Florida, I don't think anybody is living under a rock. I think everybody, certainly in the hills, understands and sees that. We also understand that what is true in the urban setting, the failures that we've seen in the urban setting are also true in the agricultural setting. The reason why the state is undertaking a first and 30-year rewrite of the stormwater rules is because they haven't worked. If they had, we wouldn't have as many impaired water bodies as we have. And so this notion of the presumption of compliance, the presumption that if you follow, for example, a set of best management practices, which is where Florida's regulatory direction turned to about 15 years ago. Okay, what we're going to do to address agriculture contribution is we're going to develop these best management practices manuals, and if you are following the best management practice manual, then we're going to presume that you are in compliance and that you're not causing or contributing to the impairment of a water body. Well, we know that for the most part, if we don't test that, if we're not out there measuring it to see whether or not they're actually working, we have no idea whether they are or not. So I think two things are happening. One, I believe that under the current agricultural commissioner, you're going to see additional validation and verification of the work that is being done in the agriculture sector with regard to the control of nutrients running off of farmland and on-site nutrient management. And then with regard to an industry like yours, it's all about the landscape. I'll point to South Florida as an example. In South Florida, the big issues dealing with Everglades, the hundreds of tons of phosphorus and nitrogen that are impairing Lake Okeechobee and the system to the south, come from agricultural areas to the north. Everybody pretty much accepts that. And so the agencies, the state is the one that is investing in landscape projects, big, huge stormwater treatment areas to help manage and control and reduce and eliminate some of that contribution. And I think that that's where there's a clear opportunity for folks that are in your space. One of the things, the companies that I work with and advise, one of the things that we don't do is we don't wait for the state to, on their schedule and at their time, identify projects that could help address those problems in areas where agriculture is a big contributor. Instead, what we're doing is we're going to communities that the state is requiring through the implementation of the the BMPs, the Basin Management Action Plans. They're legally required to reduce nutrients and legally required to address the nutrient contribution that comes from every sector. So oftentimes you find a more willing partner in a local government to come together with you, identify a piece of property that strategically could serve the function of cleaning up the waters before it goes into the impaired water bodies. So that's one of the things that I advise folks is don't wait for the game to come to you, go find the game. If you know the areas of the state where they're having the biggest challenges with impairment, engage those local governments in discussions about large-scale projects that the state is beginning to fund. And don't wait for them to come to you, you go to them.
Great, thanks Frank, and thanks for the question. Not seeing others, we do have two in the app, which I think are two targeted towards myself. So I'll answer one and then pivot one to Crystal so we're not on one person too much. So first, expanding on the details of the NIPD's water quality trading rule that I mentioned, as we understand it, this is intended to be a first phase one rulemaking. Really the intent is trying to just put out essentially a purpose statement and a preamble that would clearly give a nudge to states and ensure they feel they have the authorization to embrace the use of water quality trading to meet their NIPD's targets. As an industry association, we have been pushing for the rulemaking at this stage to go farther than that and to ideally try to embrace some of the lessons learned that we've seen from existing robust state programs, such as the Virginia Water Quality Trading Program, where you actually have certain affluent limits that are written into the permit that then triggers acquisition of the need to go out and acquire different offsets. But as we understand it, at least for now, EPA was looking to keep the scope fairly narrow and just put out a purpose statement and sort of set the groundwork for what would be language similar to a preamble, and then in a phase 2 iteration or some step down guidance, there would be more details on specific frameworks for the state. So high level for now, would like to maybe see it go into more detail, so we'll keep as an industry group doing what we can and certainly share that notice once it's available with everyone. And if there are any folks from EPA working on that role in the room, hope to hear more from you this afternoon on it. So next I want to turn to a question for Crystal, and then I'll get to the other in the chat here. So I touched on in my slides this concept of cutting green tape and just how do we expedite the permitting process, particularly for restoration projects that are producing positive environmental outcomes and to meet some of the timelines that are in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So I'm curious, what you can share on how the administration is thinking about expediting permitting for nature-based and resiliency projects, and then what can the industry be doing to help those efforts?
Sure. So thanks for that question. And I can't speak to specifics, but I will say, yesterday the White House released a White House fact sheet with some additional information, and John Podesta gave remarks around permitting, primarily speaking to energy permitting, and the fact that this is a priority of increasing the speed of permitting, not just for energy, but for all sorts of other entities, environmental permitting, increasing environmental reviews, increasing the speed. And this administration has been faster than previous administrations, but we know we're not fast enough. So certainly looking to agencies' funding that's in the Inflation Reduction Act, specifically for agencies to, and the White House, CEQ in particular, to increase staffing, to increase training, to increase technological systems to speed up the processing. We know that a lot of the things that happen one after another could be happening at the same time. So I'd say there's a lot of opportunities in terms of engagement. There's a permitting council that was set up by the White House specifically around permitting, and I think you'll see nature-based solutions be some of the fastest moving permitting, given some of the new requirements. So
that's great. That's encouraging. Yeah, we'd love to be able to plug in some of these restoration projects to a model similar to the FIPSI's dashboard. Yeah.
Sarah, on that point, this year there was a bill that was filed that attempted to expedite the permitting process for restoration projects in Florida. It didn't cross the finish line, but I know that that's an area that the leadership in the House and the Senate is focused on, because it's not just delay in time and getting good things to happen, but also the cost associated is enormous. And so it is something that Florida intends to attempt to address.
That's great. What can you share more on why it didn't cross the finish line this particular cycle? Was it just not enough of a priority, or was it actual opposition or concern?
Believe it or not, and forgive me because this is not a shot at you, the question that was raised was, well, great, let's assume that it's a project that involves earthwork and you can get an expedited review and permit out of the state. If you have to get the federal permit and go through their process anyway, what's the point?
Right.
And the argument that I made is that is the point.
Right.
Just because one process is slow doesn't mean two should be. Right. Let's at least address the one and try to do what we can with the other. So It's an issue, but it didn't die because of opposition. It just died because folks couldn't understand in the big picture how, in the short term, it would provide a real benefit.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks for your advocacy on that. So I'm looking, oh, we do have a question. Okay, great. Very good.
So I have a question that kind of goes back to the legacy, pollutants kind of going into the system in addition to water availability. With homeowner systems, homeowner associations everywhere throughout Florida, and everybody wants to have their green lawn, which means they have to water their lawn and fertilize their lawn. The residential fertilization certainly can have an impact on groundwater and nutrients in the groundwater, plus the constant watering of lawns can certainly stress the public utility systems. Is there any kind of a push to try to regulate what grasses can be used in lawns, to reduce the amount of irrigation that goes on in lawns, and to kind of push for less fertilization of lawns in Florida?
What you find is that in Florida we have a checkerboard of regulations. You have some local governments that are very progressive and will limit watering of lawns to 2 days a week, and there are other local governments that don't regulate it at all. It's an issue that up to now has been controlled at the local level. And I know it frustrates a lot of folks because there is no consistency, and the impacts that you've discussed are real. One of the things that was a curveball that hit us late in the session this year is the legislature, oddly enough, in the rarest of places, which is the bill that implements the budget. By Florida, the Constitution of the state prohibits the amendment of state law in a budget bill. But what they can do is make a one-year change in law. And that's what they did. The legislature put in a provision this year that prohibits local governments from enhancing or adopting new fertilizer ordinance laws in the state of Florida. And it was a very murky provision that was put in at the end, and everybody's still trying to figure out who was behind it and why. But it's definitely an area I think that needs addressing. The challenge of addressing things holistically is that the Association of Counties and the League of Cities bristle at anybody putting any limitations on their power and their control. So if you try to enact the statewide irrigation law, they would just go bananas, even though it makes sense. So it's a challenging thing. It's how do we incentivize the local governments to do the right thing, and that's how the state is trying to get at it in other programs, is saying if you do these things, we will give you access to certain funds. But the irrigation component is not one that has been tackled comprehensively in this state.
I'll build on that. The incentive piece may be where the opportunity is, not just for local governments, but for individual homeowners, right? Other jurisdictions have had a lot of success in terms of incentivizing specific actions, different kinds of grasses, different kinds of watering schedules, et cetera. And so that may be where it needs to go in the short term versus a regulation.
Most of the big water initiatives, water supply initiatives in the state do have a water conservation component, but everything is voluntary. And you can only get as far as, someone who's willing to make a sacrifice, and you'll be watering your lawn two times a week, and the person next to you never turns the sprinklers off because they think their lawn needs it, and it doesn't really get you anywhere. But it is an issue that needs to be addressed, without doubt.
We're almost out of time, so I want to address this one other question in the chat very quickly, which essentially is summarized as: an industry built on dynamic innovation, are bankers appropriately considering a commitment to standardization of processes and expectations to gain efficiency and streamline decisions? And I want to reiterate, one of the top priorities for the industry association has been trying to promote improvements in implementation of the 404 program, and we see that as a two-pronged, maybe three-pronged approach of: first, you have to have funding so that staff are available to be trained. It's a very complex field. They need to be able to invest a substantial portion of their time just to understanding the mitigation program and building trust with the community of bankers that are operating within their region. You also need funding to support training efforts, and so training could also be you could group in there some of the IRT workbooks that have recently come out and development of SOPs. And I wanted to highlight as well, we have put out a recommendation for a REGAL that would be focused on IRT roles and responsibilities and empowering the Corps to fully act as chair of the IRT and leading decision making and cutting off deliberation at certain deadlines and trying to move the process forward with predictability. So that is definitely remains a top priority for us, and would be happy to talk about it further if folks have questions on the different approaches that we're looking at. So we're over time, but I do want to just give a chance for Frank and Crystal from some final thoughts, and I'll throw out a fun question that I've heard before. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but knowing what you know about mitigation banking and the regulatory risk and uncertainty, would you ever be interested in becoming a mitigation banker or investing in a project?
The short answer is yes. From this standpoint, obviously, if you have the resource to invest, the answer is yes. It is clear, at least as far as the state of Florida is concerned, that the market opportunities are enormous. Again, these numbers are not going away. It's something that the legislature is now paying attention to, and I believe will continue to pay attention to. So I think that Florida is an area where you're going to see a lot of opportunities for green infrastructure, for additional wetland mitigation. The population growth of the state, everybody knows that we're one of the fastest growing states. And this water quality area is one that is going to be enormous in the state.
Yeah. Easier to invest if we can crack the nut on multi-benefit banking.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
I agree with that. I'm not going to
You can take
advise
the CQ hat off. Yeah.
whether I would invest or advise anyone else to invest, but I will agree this is a hugely important market, and we see impacts of climate. You saw those numbers increasing. Most counties, not just in Florida but across the country, are seeing impacts from climate happen, and those dollars are, those costs are rising, and so we need ways to address the problem. We'll need investment to address the problem. That's not going to go away anytime in the next, anytime soon. So, thank you for all you're doing.
Great. Thank you guys for sticking around and listening. Thank you. Thanks to our speakers, Crystal and Frank.